welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of several gorgeous works of historical fiction, the newest of which I am so excited to talk about. It is a beautiful story about love and loss and ghosts and books, all of my favorite things. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Absolutely. So my name is Alyson Richman. As Jen mentioned, I am the author of several historical fiction novels, most recently a book called The Missing Pages, which I'm excited to be talking about on the podcast today. And I live on Long Island in Huntington Bay, and I'm just really thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for joining us and for sharing this book. I was just saying before we started recording that I am currently halfway through it, and I am so in love with these characters and both of the time periods that you evoke here. I have a general question about your writing to begin. When you find yourself pondering a new book, where does it usually start for you? Is it a time you want to depict, or a setting, or a figure? Like, do you have a normal entryway into a research interest that you think might become a novel?
So no, it doesn't happen that way for me. Typically, I'll hear something and become very intrigued by it, and then start doing a deep dive to sort of understand the pieces more intricately. And if it's something I can't quite shake, I know there's a novel there. For example, the novel that we're talking about today, The Missing Pages, it delves into a unexplored legend about a Gilded Age book collector who perished on the Titanic. And I wasn't looking to do a historical novel on the Titanic. I heard about this legend because my daughter actually took a tour by herself of Harvard during a summer program a few years ago. And the tour guide took the students to Harvard Yard and got to the steps of Harry Widener Memorial Library and shared with the students that there was this legend surrounding him. He was 27 years old, a Harvard graduate, a passionate book collector. And the legend was that when the Titanic struck the iceberg and, tragedy ensued, his mother implored him to get on the lifeboat with him, but that he told his mother he had to go back to his cabin to retrieve a rare and precious book. And he was never seen again, and the book was never found. And his mother subsequently went on to build this beautiful library at Harvard that's there to this day. There's a memorial room in the library that has his original desk and chairs and houses his 3,000 volume book collection. And I just thought that that was such an incredible story. I immediately kept on seeing the scene between a mother and son, and her desperately wanting to save her child, and a child who desperately wants to give his mother the hope that he's going to get on the next lifeboat. But to me, I just assumed he was saying that because he had to stay behind with the other men, and and do the gentlemanly thing, that was not to get on the boat and take a seat from a child or a woman. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. And as the weeks went on, I started to think, well, was there any credibility that Harry Elkins Widener actually went back to his cabin to retrieve a rare and precious book? And if so, what was that book? So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but I think it gives you an insight of how someone can share something with you, and immediately you have an emotional response to it. And in this case, it was this scene between a mother and child, and also knowing that his mother went on to create this very lasting monument of her grief for her son. But also the research, what was the book? Where did he buy the book? What was his relationship with book collecting? All those questions sort of circled in my head and made me feel that there was definitely a novel to explore.
It is such a fascinating story that I was not even a little bit aware of. I didn't know the story behind that library, and I was so taken by, as you were, this monument to her grief that's in the middle of this library, this recreation of Harry's personal library.
Mean, it is. It's a very layered story, right, Jen? Because it's not just an unknown chapter in the Titanic history that really hasn't been explored. It's a book lover's dream because he was this book collector. His life was taken way too early, 27 years old, just getting started in his burgeoning book collecting. And then it's this very emotional story of how does a mother heal after the loss of a child, and is healing even possible, and where do you channel that grief, and how do you make sure that your son's name is never forgotten? And so she does create this incredible library in his honor. And one of the things that I didn't mention is that I decided to tell the story from his perspective as a ghost inside the library his mother built in his honor. So Harry is actually, told, tells his story in first person. This is sort of the spiritual element of this book that I wanted to give him a voice to tell in his own words what really happened in those last moments of the Titanic. And then I weave in a dual, timeline with a young girl by the name of Violet Hutchins, who is suffering her own personal loss. She is a student at Harvard. She finds herself employed as a page inside the library and starts to believe that she's receiving messages from Harry's ghost, beseeching her to find or discover an untold chapter in his story. So you have two timelines, two perspectives of inhabiting the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library, and then, of course, learning all this historical detail about who was Harry Elkins Widener, who was the Widener family, what was this book that he went, supposedly back to his cabin to get.
Mm. What was the research like that you did, particularly in regards for finding his voice? Did you read his letters? You referenced several letters in
Mhm.
the book itself, and I'm curious about if any of those were based in reality, if they're your creation. How did you find his voice?
So that's a wonderful question. One of the first, things that I did before even writing, a single sentence of the novel was to travel to London and visit the archives of Quaritch Limited. Quaritch Limited is the bookseller and bookstore that sold Harry the Little Bacon, which was a 16th century copy of Francis Bacon's essays that was so small, it was the size of one's palm. People, have said it was the size of a baseball card. And they have in their archives the letters leading up to Harry purchasing the Little Bacon and several other books that he bought on his book buying trip prior to boarding the Titanic. And those letters really became the essence of how I came up with his voice. I think one of the really interesting things when you start reading letters from the Gilded Ages, we have a tendency to believe that everyone spoke in very, very formal language, where actually there was like almost a breeziness to them because people wrote so many letters every day that you kind of have the levity and the whimsy that people are just sort of detailing, why they love something and when they're going to be arriving at the bookstore. And so that was really essential in basically absorbing how he used language. The archives were extremely helpful to learn about what he was purchasing. And then subsequently, upon the sinking of the Titanic, you have Bernard Quaritch writing to Harry's beloved bookseller in Philadelphia, a man named A.S.W. Rosenbach, who really was the mentor for Harry and his collecting. And Quaritch writes to Rosenbach after the Titanic sinks and says, one of the last things that Harry said before leaving my bookshop was that he was never going to take the little bacon off his person, that he was going to slip it into his dinner jacket just in case, he gets shipwrecked along his return to come home to New York. So he'll always have something to read, which of course, is very ominous in its foreshadowing, but also very emotional because Quaritch then goes on to say, I know Harry his body has not yet been found, and should a body be discovered that has a book inside its dinner jacket, it could be used to identify Harry. So, that type of research, these are like the gold nuggets when you're trying to create a voice, create a really a pyramid of who the main players are in your cast of characters. So Quaritch is featured in the missing pages. ASW Rosenbach is featured in the missing pages. And then I even went so far after doing the research of this bookstore, Quaritch, to learn that Bernard Quaritch's sister, Charlotte Quaritch, actually took over the bookstore or book selling store after his death. And that was really illuminating to me that there was a woman in the Gilded Age who was working in the antiquarian book trade, that she was able to take over the shop subsequently. And she becomes sort of the inspiration behind my character, Ada Lippenhold, who is sort of the liaison with Harry's book buying prior to his arrival in London. And there's a love story woven into the missing pages between the two of them.
I'm really loving their romance. It is so sweet. And I think there's a time-honored tradition in literature. I can think of Dante off the top of my head, but so many others of people falling in love over books, and I think that that's depicted really beautifully here.
Well, thank you, Jen, for saying that. I mean, I loved creating the character of Ada. She's like the ultimate book heroine. She's smart, she's sassy, she knows her own mind, she's collecting on the side. She's not trying to become a trophy wife in any way. You see who she interacts with, like Belle de Costa Green, for your readers who've read The Personal Librarian. She's a really, spunky gal. And I loved writing her. And then to your point about falling in love, romances that deal with book lovers, I think it's a really wonderful narrative for an author to create and to spin because, authors and readers, we love books, and book loving is its own love language, right? I mean, if you meet someone who loves books as much as you do, or loves the novels or the, authors that you love, you do feel yourself anchoring yourself to them very quickly, right? I mean, my husband and I fell in love with our mutual adoration of Gabriel Garcia Marquez when we discovered that on our first date. I was like, oh my God, he's the one. So like it happens even in today's times.
Yeah, absolutely. And capturing Violet's voice. So Violet, as you mentioned, is your second perspective. She's at Harvard in the 90s. My first question has to do with shaping her character and how your choice of the person that you write in plays into that. Because you mentioned that Harry is written in the first person and Violet's written in like a close third. What
Mhm.
drove that choice for you, and what did you want to say about her with that?
Mm. So, for me, my background prior to writing was in art, and I wanted to be a painter like my mother. So when I'm conceiving a novel, I really do envision the text almost as like a canvas, a blank canvas, which every brush stroke that a painter might put on the canvas, I'm imagining applying every sentence onto the blank page. So doing two narratives. I wanted the first person for Harry because I wanted it to be almost like the impasto. That's a technique where you have very thick brushwork that comes out almost sculpturally in high relief from the canvas, and the most immediate voice that's going to draw you in. And then I wanted Violet to be the voice that sort of was receding. It was there in the background. It connects the storyline, but his voice is the one that's always going to come forward. So, I look for me, it's not a two-dimensional experience writing. It's really almost three-dimensional. And the closeness of her voice, though, I did want you to have an emotional response to it, to understand her grief, to understand why she is drawn to the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library and what it means for her as she moves through her mourning after this very devastating loss over her boyfriend. So, that's what I was envisioning and why I did it. I think doing two first person voices, it's there's a time and place for it, but not in this case. I wrote two first person voices in The Lost Wife, where you had a couple that separated during World War II. Both of them are remembering, how they came to be separated, and then eventually you learn how they reconnect at a wedding, decades later. But it's also a very intimate and personal way of telling a story. But in this case, I didn't want Violet's voice competing with Harry's. Specifically also because the drama of Harry's story, knowing that he's going to perish on the Titanic. I mean, you open in the missing pages knowing very well that this is a ghost inside the library, that he's been listening for decades of these tour guides telling his story at the base of, the steps of the library his mother built in his honor.
That makes total sense to me. And I think it has the nice added effect of, Violet is a person who, because of the grief she's experiencing, is feeling very alienated from everybody around her. That layered on top of sort of the separation that she already feels given her imposter syndrome, right? Of being a sort of not as well-resourced person as Harvard. I
Mhm.
found that very resonant for myself because I was a scholarship kid at NYU in the early aughts, and I was always very aware of not having as much money as the people around me. And
Mm.
so I think that it has that added effect of like that recreates the sort of alienation a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. And I interviewed a lot of Harvard students for this book and some of them who had worked at Widener Library. And I was surprised to learn that so many Harvard students do have that sort of imposter syndrome and that there is, this tremendous amount of wealth that makes, students even coming from sometimes upper middle class backgrounds feel that they are, outsiders there. So, it was something that because when more than one person tells you that, you have to sort of pay attention and think, well, maybe this would be, add a very realistic layer to the novel and to the character of the novel.
Absolutely. Um, there's a thread that has sort of woven itself through so far, where characters in the present and the past spend time talking about and thinking about the pre-Raphaelites.
Mm.
Uh, there's a lot of Elizabeth Siddal or Siddal, I always forget how to say her last name, and Rossetti. And I, since I was a teen, a very, a very moody, romantic type teen, was obsessed with them. So I was wondering if you also sort of were fascinated by the pre-Raphaelites and how they find their way threaded through.
Oh, I'm so happy that you're a fellow pre-Raphaelite lover like myself. So, you know, for me, I feel my strengths in writing historical fiction are writing the characters from another time. I always have felt that was sort of, you know, misplaced in modern day times that I wished I was born, a century before. So I was a young college student in the 90s. I went to Wellesley College right outside of Boston. I went to Harvard Square all the time. And I love the pre-Raphaelites. I dressed like a pre-Raphaelite. I wore my hair. I had long auburn hair that way. I love the poetry. I love Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poetry, his paintings, Elizabeth Siddal, the legend about her. I loved all of it. And so Violet is really inspired. I've woven a lot of myself into her, even how she takes Hugo to the Harvard bookstore to go to the poetry section downstairs. All of those things, getting a chocolate croissant at Au Bon Pain. That was me in 1992 college student. And so I'm so happy that you were sort of the same with the Raphaelites. So when they dress up for Halloween and she wants to be Elizabeth Siddal, I just, how could I resist? I did that myself.
Yeah, I think especially as somebody who was sort of a lonely college student, and that coincided with the time that I was the most obsessed with the pre-Raphaelites. There was something about their art, I think, that made it easier to feel extreme emotions for somebody who maybe wasn't very expressive in my emotions, like because their art and their lives just capture, there is so much passion, so much pain, so much loss, but so much joy. There's just so much in that rich, rich tradition of artwork that I think is very powerful for somebody who's trying to find their way in the world for the first time, perhaps.
Yes, and I also think, I mean, you were probably I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you probably love to read too. And so
Mhm.
the pre-Raphaelites love to explore, Arthurian legends and things like that. And to paint them and to bring these stories to life through paint and so and poetry and all those things. So I think they're very layered, right? They're painting, but they're also storytelling. And I think that was also part of the allure for us.
That's a great point. Yeah, that their artwork is very narrative, not only in its references and what it depicts from literature, but almost in that like medieval art style, where like the art is telling a story itself.
Absolutely. And I mean, and if you think of John Everett Millay's, Ophelia, which I mean, so many of us were obsessed with, when we first learned about it. And now you see in 2025, Taylor Swift, going back to that legend and writing a song about it. I think it's people who are storytellers or love stories. I think those legends and those artists who explored those legends, the poets who explored them. Again, it's multifaceted, it's multi-layered, and I think that's part of the appeal.
Oh, absolutely. Oh my gosh, that particular Ophelia painting, when I moved into my college dorm, I hung that on my wall, and my roommate had a Michael Jordan poster on her side, and I feel like I must have scared her so much just with
Love. I wish I had done that as a scene in the book. That would have been perfect.
Wow. So I'm curious, I ask this of most people who write dual perspective books or narratives that go back and forth in time. Do you write your singular narratives as a unit and then interweave them, or do you write them in dialogue? And do they change each other perhaps as you write?
So you might find this very disappointing, but I do not have an outline. I don't write anything separately. I just get up in the morning every day and start writing, and I build from, chapter to chapter. So the modern day story chapters come almost as if you can imagine a dancer deciding to take a turn. It's sort of intuitive. That once I've said as much as I want to say, particularly in the historical timeline, I think, okay, now I need a different direction here to,
Mm,
to switch my brain up, to get a little breath in my lungs, to tell it from a different perspective. I mentioned to you before that I come from an artistic background, and one of the things my mother always told me that, a painting is only great if it's interesting from all directions, and to constantly change what you're working on and to try and see it from a different perspective or lens. Even when you're looking at a piece of sculpture, to walk around the sculpture, look from underneath the sculpture to get something new. And so I'm always doing that in my mind when I'm telling a story, like, well, I've said this and that's interesting, but now let me look at it from this perspective. And so it's an intuitive dance I do with my head when I'm telling a story. I could never write something separately, I don't think, and then weave it in. I know authors do. It's just not how my brain works.
mm. That makes total sense to me, and it does sound very intuitive. And I'm always curious about, because when you're ending a chapter and going on to another where you're, shifting perspectives, sometimes that shift is because you want to show something new.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's because you don't want to reveal something yet. So you're moving away from something as opposed to toward. I hope this kind of makes
Yes,
sense. But
absolutely.
yeah.
Yes. So, yes. And, I've been writing now for over 25 years. My first novel, The Mask Carver's Son, came out in 2000. So it's interesting as I get older how that also shapes how I write. I really like writing non-linear timelines now. I find it more of a challenge, and I like this sort of, again, I don't want to use the word challenge twice, but this hurdle to, you take a story and it has all these different pieces, and it's like taking a goblet and dropping it on the floor and all those different shards of glass. How do you reassemble them? And doing it in a way that can have a surprise for the reader that they might not have been expecting. I really enjoy that. It's hard. I think telling a linear storyline and one that doesn't have two timelines is probably easier. Not, I mean, it depends. Obviously, not always, but for me, I'm enjoying doing writing like that now.
Nice. Yeah, and I always enjoy a nonlinear story too, because I think, even though we exist in linear time, we don't
Mhm.
really experience our lives that way. Like we're always existing in multiple times at once.
Mhm.
And I think that's also like a truth that ghost stories help get at, right? Like we exist now and we're moving through time, but also our minds are in another place and then we get stuck in places. And I love the emotional truth of ghost stories. And they're so fitting around, the holidays. It's like a rich ghost tradition around this time of year too. It's just a lovely read.
Oh, and thank you. And I also love that, the ghost, writing from the perspective of a ghost, he's the ultimate omniscient narrator, right?
Mhm.
He knows exactly what happened in the past. He's not an unreliable narrator. He lived it, but yet he's also present. He's omnipresent. He's everywhere. He can see what's going on, and he has this wealth of wisdom of, being in in Harry's case, nearly a century in his library, witnessing what's happened through the doors of this monument his mother built in his honor. He's witnessed his mother's grief. He still has the emotions. He's a true essence, a spirit. So it's a wonderful device, I think, to be able to tell a story through the voice of a ghost because they move fluidly through past and into the present without, the readers believing that how could they know this? They know it because they're the ultimate spirit.
So, what is next for you? I know you're probably still busy promoting this book, but are you writing at the moment?
I am. I am working currently on a book about Edith Wharton's time in Paris during World War One when she was helping Belgian children, refugees, bringing them to Paris from Belgium after suffering tremendous loss there. Most of them were orphans. And she created these hostels there where there were schools and also lace schools so that the young women of age, when they got to be, I think, around 10 years old, could learn the trade of lace making, the craft of lace making. And she had this whole endeavor where she was taking the lace and helping make lingerie that was sold back in New York to then fundraise for her work in Paris with the refugees. So that's one of the timelines. And then I'm also weaving in the story of her country home in Lenox, Massachusetts, the Mount, and their acquisition of her remaining library in 2005, trying to get it back on their shelves so that they can have a living artifact of Edith and her writing and the books that influenced her.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. Well, I can't wait to read that one. And, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It was a wonderful interview. Thank you so much, Jen. And I hope your patrons and any readers who are listening to the podcast enjoy the missing pages.
Thank you. All right, listeners, please check out The Missing Pages. It's available now. It'll be available as you hear this. So head to your favorite library or bookstore. Do you have a place that you like to send people for books?
Well, of course, I always like everyone to support their local bookstore. If you're on Long Island and you're listening to this, I do have signed copies always available at the Next Chapter in Huntington and Theodore's Books in Oyster Bay. But I'm happy whenever people read and as long as they get their books legally, either through the library or the bookstore, I'm a very happy author.
Excellent. Those are two very good bookstores you've suggested. So, all right. Well, listeners, thank you for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.